Everyone thought it was impossible. They said glass wouldn't trap any heat, that wind would destroy it, that the design was foolish. But when winter's fiercest storm hit, this inverted greenhouse didn't just survive, it grew tomatoes in the snow. The first thing that pressed against the house each morning wasn't a sound so much as a presence, cold, patient, and flat, leaning on the eaves and waiting for the sun to earn its warmth. It settled into the corners before light, made the windows bloom with frost from the inside, and taught the Turner farmhouse the shape of winter like a lesson repeated. Eli Turner learned that lesson with his skin. He woke to it, ate with it, and, if he let his thoughts wander, measured the day by how the wind kissed the metal ridges of the roof and left the mule's breath hanging like steam in the yard. Built against all the rules, this inverted cabin has become a benchmark in survival. It was not an idea anyone in the valley would have called orthodox. Rules in that place were old habits and hard-earned warnings. Keep doors tight, stack wood high, trust the stove. Never trust a roof you hadn't watched go up plank by plank. Eli knew the rules. He respected them enough to move within them. He also kept his head down long enough to notice what the rules never named. The silent work the wind did at night, the way it found small gaps and widened them into drafts, the way it stole heat, not in a hurry, but in a patience more dangerous than any sudden storm. He was 16 when he first voiced the thought, not with the bluster of youth, but with the slow, quiet curiosity that had him taking apart village radios in the spare hours and sketching curves of boards on the back of old envelopes. His father, Thomas Turner, had a blade in the shed, a pile of seasoned oak, and the distrust of newness that comes from a lifetime of weather. He liked things that held. Thomas measured the valley the way a mason measures a wall, by the sound it makes and the company it keeps. Eli measured it differently. He watched where the snow piled and where it ran off. He crouched by the old smokehouse on the edge of their grove and put his hand against its outer skin. The smokehouse was a small, stubborn thing, 2 shells in one, a rough log room within a clappered husk. Inside it stayed drier, slower to freeze. Outside, the wood bore the weather and took the punishment. It was, Eli realized, an inverted idea, an outer hull that took the blows, letting the inner room behave as if the world were quieter. He said the word aloud in the dark. What if the house did not have to be hit by wind at all? No one in the valley would have called Eli industrious in a way that looked like expertise. He had a practical streak and a patience that made him watch for patterns. He could tell the difference between a wind that carried grit and a wind that carried icicles. He could tell you the hours when the stove would start to fail if one more person sat in the kitchen, leaning into the heat with boots still wet from the snow. He had a mule whose name was Hank, a cat that trusted the stove more than it trusted people, and a small hand-me-down measuring square that he carried in his pocket more as a comfort than a tool. Those domestic shapes became the grammar of his thinking: animals, small metal squares, a stove that served as the village's thermometer. When Eli first spoke of building a shell around the cabin, he used the old word his mother had used for the hull of a boat, something that wraps the vulnerable part inside. He drew a rough curve in the dust with his finger and named it an inverted cabin, an outer, hull-like shell that sits over the cabin, leaving an insulating air gap between skin and house. It would not change the stove or the woodpile or how the people inside lived. It would change what the wind touched. "Sounds like a tent," said old Mads at the depot where Eli scavenged for corrugated metal. Mads wore an expression of collective caution that covered half the town. His hands held the quiet language of people's approval and disapproval both. "We've had tents. Tents leak and fold." "It isn't a tent," Eli answered, because he had learned that the first thing to do with a notion was to pronounce it clearly, even if it sounded naive. He had watched the smokehouse. He had seen how double walls stayed warm. He had thought of ribs and skin, and the way a ship takes the brunt so the cargo inside keeps steady. Words slotted into his mind like small sticks into a frame. Ribs, air gap, hull. He spoke them with caution, not with the hubris of those who think a single bright idea can beat a season. At home, Thomas frowned when Eli laid out the thought on the kitchen table. The stove crackled between them like a small, angry animal. Thomas had watched winters get meaner in the way some things age, them harder at the joints, not in sudden collapses. He had half a lifetime of carpentry behind him, and a toolbox full of measured opinions. "You mean shell it?" he asked, not with mockery, but as if he were trying on a coat he had not ordered. "Yes," Eli said, "not a permanent build in your mind like new jammed against old. Like a hull. Leave a space. Let the wind hit the shell." Thomas tapped the edge of his cup. He did not like the phrase that followed, the one Eli offered politely to soften his own measures. "I could do it with scrap." The word scrap sounded either frugal or dangerous, depending on the way the stove light caught Thomas's face. You could hear the rules forming in his replies. "No codes for that," he said. "No guarantee it'll hold." When he spoke of guarantees, he didn't mean paperwork. He meant lives and roofs and a town's quiet reliance on the way things had always been done. Thomas had watched improvisation before. He had seen it done by men who thought guts were the same thing as judgment. He had seen roofs come down. He had cast his doubt as a father does, a protective instinct not yet convinced by curiosity. Eli kept watching anyway. The valley had a salvage depot on the far road where people traded things for credit or caffey bucks, and sometimes for good measure. Eli rode Hank there, the mule's steps reliable as metronome clicks, his own breath shaping like small clouds in the cold air. The depot smelled of oil, rust, and old stories. There were sheets of corrugated metal, bent and sun-creased. There were saplings with bark stripped in neat spirals. There were fasteners that had once held signs, but now would only hold a promise. Eli's fingers learned the language of metal, how it feathered at a torn edge, how it thrummed to a fingernail hit, how cold made it sing in a different pitch. He learned to test what a scrap could do without treating it like certain architecture. People noticed the rides and commented by the gap at the depot and in the shop where Mrs. Calder kept a list of friendly debts. "Boy's building something," they'd say, and there was a tone in it that's hard to translate, equal parts affection and suspicion. The valley liked inventiveness, so long as it did not overstep the line between brave and foolish. Eli was learning slowly that most hands in the shacks and sheds of his neighbors were calloused for good reasons. They had been burned by weather and poor advice alike. It was not just that they mocked the plan. They were cautious because survival measured itself by a long history of small errors. Eli took these murmurs as a windbreak, opinion that bent and let him pass through. He began with posts, not a blueprint-driven foundation, but long round posts set into ground that had the bedrock of frost to reckon with. He and Thomas sank them together one dawn when the sky had not yet decided whether to let the light in. The mule watched from a distance as if deciding which human was brighter and which was merely restless. For a while, Thomas said nothing. He simply dug. There are things a father can grant before he gives his blessing: time, presence, the weight of his hand guiding a bit of rope. Eli asked him to hold a post, to offer the steadiness of a practiced shoulder, and Thomas did. They used steam saplings as ribs, thin curves that, when bent, held memory like bone. Eli liked the shape of those ribs. He imagined them like the inside of a boat, a repeated arc that could hold skin in place. He tied them with rope inherited from a neighbor and bolted the metal in a way he described only as knowing where each sheet wanted to sit. He was careful. He worked in small bursts, stopping to feel the seams and to listen, listening to timber expand, to rope sing under load, to the metal's complaint when it was wrong. There were no arrogant rhythms to his labor. There was a patient series of tests, putting a sheet up, waiting for the weather, observing how the wind pooled. The first nights they sang along with the wind. The house inside did not yet feel different. The outer shell rattled and made new music against the rafters. Eli wasn't disappointed. He had expected that early work would be noisy and imperfect. He wanted data, quiet evidence. The first cut came sharp and ordinary. Eli had a pocket knife he'd sharpened and kept clean. One morning he tucked a thumb too close to a strip of tin while fighting the wind on a new seam, and the world narrowed down to an immediate, hot surprise. It was a clean cut, enough to bleed and enough to teach him that patience needed to live in the muscles as well as in the mind. Thomas took over the stitches with a practiced calmfulness that felt like weather itself, steady, sure, without apology. They wrapped the wound in gauze and then wrapped the wound in more quiet. That injury rearranged how they worked. Where Eli had been able to push and prod as if he were alone with his idea, now Thomas introduced pauses and checks that Eli had treated before as the tyranny of a cautious mind. Thomas set down rules: use gloves, mark the edges with chalk, belt the metal to stabilize it, even if it slowed the work by a margin that felt excruciating. Eli learned the shape of slow. Slow, he found, built safety into the structure because it built safety into the men who built it. He learned to ask for help where before he'd felt an insistence to prove something bold. Neighbors began to watch with a different tone. Where suspicion once lived, a softer curiosity took root in the spaces they left on the fence. Mrs. Calder walked over one afternoon with a pot of stew and a question that wasn't exactly about design. "You sure you got enough wood?" she asked, and smiled in the way people smile when they test the grit of a plan. Her husband brought a thermos and sat on the steps, breathing steam in deliberate puffs as if his own breath could weigh the air for them. The first nights after a portion of shell went up were not theatrical. The house still smelled of last night's stew. The stove still kept the kitchen warm enough for the cat to decide whether to nap closer or farther. But small things happened that made Eli feel like he could measure progress. Smoke drifted differently from the chimney, not more, but it changed its path as if the outer hull rerouted the draft in modest, practical ways. The stove took longer to cool when the fire went down. The woodpile that used to have to be replenished each day could hold off for one more night. Not miracles, but small margins. Thicker sleep, less nervous woodwatching. Eli learned to be precise about how he celebrated these small gains. He did not tell tales of grand transformations in the market or declare the plan gospel. He wrote down temperatures in a small notebook his mother used to keep lists in, but he annotated them with humility. Marginal improvement, needs more ventilation testing, promising but not definitive. Writing things out taught him to resist narrative inflation. He wanted the idea to be understood as a patient project, not a sermon. Rumors, as rumors do, accrued color. Some told the story of the boy who tried to cover his house in metal and had the gall to think he knew more than the snow. Others, more generous, called him inventive. Eli ignored both. He kept the process honest by keeping it visible. He would lift a sheet and invite a neighbor to put their hand inside the air gap. He'd point out how, when the wind rushed past the outer skin, the inner room didn't get the full blow. "You're not sealing the house to the world," he'd say, wary of the way a single sentence could be read as either brilliance or foolishness. "You're asking the wind to take its knocks on the hull." That statement, both literal and metaphor, made some people frown. The idea of asking rather than forcing the weather to behave was foreign to those who had always met storms head-on. They tested vents conceptually rather than as an engineering diagram. Eli and Thomas put low and high openings in the shell, small, adjustable, to watch how air moved when the stove was burning. They watched for condensation, for the way stale air pooled, for any sign that trapping warmth meant trapping danger. The tests were pragmatic. If smoke backed up or condensation grew, they modified. If the air gap's quietness preserved the inner wood from frost, they noted it. It was an ongoing experiment. It stayed, crucially, an experiment. Other setbacks arrived like small animals at the larder. A rain that was warmer than winter should allow crease the corrugated metal in a place they'd thought safe, letting a small leak make a map of rust where the shell met the porch. A gust once lifted a corner of a sheet and bent it like the jaw of an old plier, and they had to take the sheet down and reseat it with different ties. Each fix taught them two things: how to make the shell more resilient and how to be humble about claiming success too early. The injuries of metal and misjudgment taught patience. Thomas watched Eli learn to slow his pace. He watched his son's patience turn a madcap idea into deliberate craft. The valley's chorus of skepticism quieted in a new way. Folks still argued on porches, and there were evenings when someone would edge over with a joke meant to unsettle Eli, the way tide unsettles a boat. But more often now, people walked over with questions that sounded almost like a wish. They wanted to know if the shell could keep their porches dry, if it could ease the frantic wood hauling 2 towns over. They came with experience folded into their tone, not ridicule. Mrs. Calder admitted she had been wrong to call it a tent. She confessed that she had slept through a night without waking to chop more wood because the kitchen had stayed warm longer. Eli took to keeping the mule hitched a bit longer in the yard. Hank was a creature who liked routine and despised surprises. The mule's steady presence was a North Star when the rest of the valley's moods shifted with each weather report. Eli fed Hank first, then took care of the cat's insistence on a warmed lap. He would sit in the kitchen, the measuring square in his pocket like a soft metronome, and watch the stove for any sign of caprice. He was a builder who had discovered that domestic rituals mattered as much as construction method, the way you stacked ash, the precise time you banked a fire, the patience of letting a single seam breathe before you fixed it permanently. Word spread because Mrs. Calder's stew tasted sweeter when served around his table after a long day. People came and sat on rough chairs, hands white from the cold, and watched the curve of the shell in the low light. They felt the air change inside. They did not call it miraculous. They called it different in a good way. Thomas was careful not to let his son become a banner. He continued to remind Eli that a single house could be an interesting experiment without being a universal rule. The title proposed by some in town, The Boy Who Sheltered the Valley, was one Thomas rolled his eyes at in private. He knew the danger of narratives. He also knew the value. The shell, as a name and a thing, began to gather both attention and a slippery kind of authority. Eli took the attention in with a modest, almost embarrassed sort of pride. He would answer a question with a quiet fact. It made the interior temperature more forgiving for longer between feedings of the stove. He would refuse to call the shell the final answer. "It depends on the house and the winter," he'd say. He emphasized the need for testing, for local thinking. He avoided charts and proclamations. He kept his notebook. He drew ribs in the margins, those curved saplings in repeated arcs, and he wrote observations beneath them in pencil. When summer came, if the valley could be said to have a summer that mattered beyond the season of repair, Eli and Thomas finished a section of the outer shell's facing. The bent ribs ran like a set of exposed ribs on a ship, each one binding the skin to shape. The metal, once flashed by sun and then dulled by rain, shone differently across days. The cat liked to sleep under a particular overhang where a slant of sun would come through. Neighbors passing by remarked on the curve the way people remark on a new fence or a newly plowed field. The shell had become part furniture, part rumor, part experiment. But winter waits. The valley seasons do not hurry because a person wants them to. The weather reads patience into everything humans attempt to control. As autumn compressed into its final days, the clouds turned hard and northern in their purpose. Weather was a thing that could be read through color and barometer, through animal behaviors and the patterns in the creek. Eli watched hawks ride the thermals longer than they should have, watched the creek's pace saunter differently. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the sky gathered sternness. The town's talk shifted its cadence. Where earlier there had been idle curiosity and the occasional friendly snub, now there was a sense of thrum. People began to ask whether the shell would hold up when the wind that loves to test the valley came back. Concern and curiosity braided into something denser, a question of whether the shell's modest margins would be enough to free a family from the treadmill of perpetual firewood. Eli felt the shift like the tightening of a rope, not ominous, but purposeful. The simple words he had whispered in warm months, air gap, hull, began to be repeated by others with a different weight. Thomas, who had kept a cautious distance between pride and endorsement, found himself accepting visitors in a way he had not before. He answered questions with the kind of measured voice that had raised Eli, a man who had learned to value small victories and to distrust the word guarantee. When someone asked if they should try it, he'd say the same thing he always said. Think it through. Test it. Don't do it because someone else did. His care was a gentle refusal to let a single success be an instruction manual. Eli's work continued in the new cold. They reinforced seams, adjusted ribs, and checked the low vents to make sure condensation would not quietly collect and rot the wooden edges. He moved like someone who had been given a live experiment and had no desire to rush the evidence. He paced himself by the mule's grazing and the cat's naps, by the stove's nightly sighs. He took more care in fastening sheets, not to document exact patterns, but to make sure each metal edge eased into the one that met it. On one pale morning, with a sky that looked as if it had been ironed flat, and stars that still kept the memory of night, the first serious weather report traveled through the valley like a list of names called aloud. A northerner was coming, the kind that folded cold into the bones of things. The men at the blacksmith's and in the depot who had once smirked now craned their necks toward the Turner's house as they went about their tasks. Eli felt the change as a pressure on his chest that had nothing to do with the cold: accountability. The shell, for all its humble beginnings, was becoming an idea that others held in their mouths like a map. He made his rounds with the dog-eared notebook in his back pocket. He checked the stove, he checked the low gaps, he tightened the straps that kept a section of metal from taking off like a sloppy shoebox in a gust. His hands moved in the sequence of years of doing things by hand, measure with the eye, test with the touch, and always leave room for correction. Thomas watched from the porch at a distance that said he was ready to step in but wanted to let Eli stand as the one who'd conceived the hull. In that distance there was trust that had been earned in the small cuts and shared stitches. By late afternoon the sky had the matte look of someone about to speak sternly. Clouds moved with intent. The valley's usual low hum softened to a collective intake of breath. People checked their stores and their children. Old Mads tied down his loose shutters. Mrs. Calder wrapped provisions and left at the house a small, careful pan, the kind one saves for sharing bread. The sense of community tightened. There is a peculiar dignity to people who prepare without panicking. They pile wood not because they fear the end, but because they respect procedure. Preparations are a ritual of mutual recognition. I respect winter, so I will be ready, so I will be able to lend a hand. Eli stood at a corner of the shell and watched the valley hold its breath. The ribs of the outer structure looked like the inside of some immense, inverted boat that had washed ashore and chosen to shelter a family rather than cargo. The term inverted cabin had somehow, against the rules of the town's cautious language, slipped from Eli's private sketchbook into the public's vocabulary. Saying it out loud now made Eli feel vulnerable and oddly responsible. He adjusted a strap, felt the metal's temper under his glove, and listened to the wind get its first good words in as evening leaned toward dark. There was a moment, as the first line of the weather crested the ridge, when he could have done nothing at all and told himself that waiting was its own kind of wisdom. But a man learns to balance waiting with acting. The two are partners, not rivals. He walked the perimeter, checking that vents were clear, that the seam where the metal met the porch had been battened down. He did not follow a plan with numbers or diagrams. He followed practice, habits formed over days and months of slowing down, paying attention, and correcting the obvious mistakes. Neighbors passed with lamps and asked with a tilt of their heads whether they could come in if needed. Eli nodded and offered a steadying, "There will be room." He meant it. The shell would not make their house a fortress. It would, he hoped, make it a quieter place, and in the valley, quiet had weight. Quiet could mean the difference between a night waking to tend the furnace every hour and a night where one slept through dark until morning. He hoped the margins were enough. That night the wind started as a curiosity and then sharpened into something with teeth. It ran lines across the metal sheets like a comb drawn hard over hair. The roof of the shell sang new notes under its force. The house inside felt like a person beneath a heavy coat, protected but aware of the movement outside. Eli sat near the stove, fingers warmed on a tin mug, and watched the flames behave as if satisfied by a measured diet. He caught himself thinking of the smokehouse, how the double skin had preserved its contents from the worst of weather by being the thing the wind struck first. He did not sleep much. He checked the seams as gusts pulled at seams, steadying straps and listening with a sensitivity that had become second nature. Each time he adjusted something, he made a small note in the penciled book, not for anyone's lecture but as a record of learning. The shell was not a finished creature. It was a thinking thing, slowly learning how to breathe. When dawn came, the valley had the look of a place that held its own secrets. Snow rested in new drifts, and where the wind had scoured, it had left polished ridges that cut light into stiff angles. People emerged and looked at one another with the shared language of those who had tested themselves against weather and found themselves intact or found themselves altered. Mrs. Calder walked across to the Turners with a blanket folded over her arm and a face that had been softened by sleep and gratitude. She asked, not wanting to be simple, if they had fared well. Eli could have said, tentatively, carefully, that the stove had required a little less coaxing. He said instead that the interior had been warmer for longer, that the air was not the same kind of hungry as it had been before the shell. The words had the cautious sincerity he always used. He did not promise this would be so everywhere. Other neighbors peered at the shell's curve with new attention, walking its arc with their hands in their pockets as if seeing the ribs anew. Thomas stood at the edge of his steps and watched the town's reaction with something like a private smile. He said to no one in particular, "Not bad for thinking outside the rule book." He did not mean to sneer at rules. He merely meant to note that sometimes necessity pulls at the edges of what is considered sensible. The valley would keep talking for days. There would be people who called it a sensible adaptation, others who would still prefer the old ways because they did not want to trade knowledge for curiosity. But the shell had done something that mattered. It had shifted a common assumption. Heat need not be fought alone. It could be preserved by design that took the wind's will into account. The idea that one might build an outer hull, an inverted cabin, that absorbs the wind to spare the inner life of a home, had quietly made a place to stand. Eli, who had begun with a finger in dust and a notion about the smokehouse, found himself aligned with a quiet responsibility that he had not expected. He was not a prophet of winter, nor a paragon of construction. He was a person who had watched patiently, who had tested and adapted, who had bled and learned to let his father steer the steady pace. He had engineered nothing that would fit a code book. He had created a thing that worked in a particular place, in a particular way. That distinction mattered to him. As the town's curiosity settled into a practical kind of admiration, Eli kept writing in his notebook. Notes that were as much about people as about seams. How Mrs. Calder's stew tasted different after a night in a warmer kitchen. How Hank the mule had kicked at a loose sheet and then settled down, as if approving. How the cat had slept on the hearth and mewed once in the morning like a vote. And yet, even as praise kindled in small places, Eli's mind stayed forward. He had seen enough to be hopeful, not certain. He had seen enough to know that a storm could test more than seams. The valley's winters were not just a single night. They were seasons stitched together by weather that changes its mind and grows more demanding over the years. He had gathered enough evidence to believe the shell made a practical difference, but he also knew the work ahead, more testing, more listening, and a humility baked into the craft. When the messenger from town, little more than a boy on a borrowed bicycle, arrived with the news that a more serious system of storms was expected the following week, a new tension threaded through the valley. Not fear, exactly. More like an attentive folding of people inward toward the things that mattered. The Turners prepared with the rest, stacking wood and checking ropes. Eli looked at the inverted cabin with the weary love of a person who has watched something fragile learn to stand. He felt the weight of expectations. The shell had to be more than a report in Mrs. Calder's kitchen. He wanted it to be a quiet, useful proof that careful thought and incremental testing could make a difference. Even then, he refused to speak in absolutes. The inverted cabin, as he described it to those who asked, was not a universal answer. It was an approach. Observe, test, adapt, and always respect the wisdom of the older hands who had built the valley. He stressed safety in small trials. He told the children who watched with wide eyes that curiosity needs patience. He told the adults who pressed him for a blueprint that their houses and their rules mattered, and any adaptation had to be done with regard to those differences. The morning the sky finally hardened into the kind of weather that gets written about in dispatches, Eli's hands trembled with more than cold as he took the last careful walk around the shell. He checked a strap he had adjusted the night before and stood with his palm on the curve of the metal. The shell, in that moment, looked less like a scheme and more like a patient animal, alive to the touch, holding itself taut but not rigid, ready to take a beating if the world chose to deliver one. He thought of the smokehouse, the ribs, the mule, and the stove. He thought of his father's quiet acceptance and the small hand of the town that had grown used to seeing their humble house wrapped in a new skin. There was nothing heroic about the posture he took as the first heavy winds came like an honest test. He could only offer the house and the people inside the simplest thing invention can give. Time. Time to prove itself, or time to teach them where it failed. At the edge of the Turner's yard, a figure approached. Mrs. Calder, blanket over both arms, eyes steady. Behind her, two more silhouettes, a neighbor with a child's small boot dangling from his hand, and old Mads, who had come despite the scolding winds. They did not come as supplicants, and they did not come as critics. They came as people who had decided that the line between experiment and community obliges the town to share in the consequence of both success and failure. Eli met them at the gate, fingers raw and thoughts taut. He welcomed them with a nod and a word. There is room. The phrase felt like the simplest truth he had ever spoken. He could not promise miracles. He could promise shelter. He could promise that he had tried to put the wind where he thought it could do the least harm. The first heavy gust found the Turners' yard with no dramatic announcement. It arrived the way a cautious animal tests a fence, nose first, then shoulder. The metal of the shell quivered under its breath. For a moment Eli simply listened. The sound was not a calamity. It was a conversation between the weather and a new thing. He felt with a core calm he had learned from years of waking to the same cold that whatever the wind chose to teach them would also be a lesson for the valley. He would write it down, he would share it, and he would do so with the same modesty with which he'd started, cautious, patient, and willing to learn. The storm had not yet declared its full intention. It was only beginning to speak. The valley held its breath. The inverted cabin held its frame. Inside, by the stove's patient flame, Eli sat with the weight of expectation like a hand folded over his own. He was ready to see whether his patient, rule-bending idea could stand when the world leaned in hard. The wind did not give them a warning so much as it offered a single, long test. It arrived in a band that blurred the horizon, a moving wall that sounded like a distant herd. The first hour was bristling and bright, the kind of wind that strips the last color from a field and leaves the world in a disciplined gray. Then the teeth came, gusts that pushed and held, that tried to take purchase on anything that dared to stand too loose. The shell answered in the language Eli had hoped for. Metal flexed and sang, seams that had been fussed over for weeks, held their breath and then held their place. The curved ribs he had tied and retied took the blows like bent branches, giving until they could not give more, and then settling back into their arc. From inside, the house felt oddly dignified. The stove's heat moved through familiar channels, and the air, though sharp at the windows, lacked the frantic hunger it used to have. It was not warm as a summer day. It was merely more forgiving. It let people sleep without the stove's watchful ticking in their bones. When the knock came at the kitchen door, Eli was not surprised to see Mrs. Calder first. She stood there with the blanket clutched around her shoulders, cheeks flushed from the wind, her eyes bright with the kind of practical worry that had kept her scraping ice from milk pails for 30 winters. Behind her came the neighbor with the child, and a few footsteps later, old Mads. They arrived as if accepting a test invitation rather than begging a miracle. They fanned out into the kitchen with the half-formal reserve of people who understand the dignity in asking for shelter. Inside, the house smelled like last night's stew and the mineral-clean scent of metal warmed by a stove. The cat had threaded itself into a human lap and made a small, snooty purr of approval. Children were hushed, voices stayed low. No one made the storm into a spectacle. There was the practical kindness of putting down boots and helping hands to shake snow into a bowl. Eli showed them the inner wall and the air gap without triumph. He opened a small, low vent and then a high one, letting them feel the way air traveled when there was a fire versus when there was none. He spoke with the same modesty he'd always used, an explanation, not an advertisement. At one point, as a gust took a louder, angrier tone, the shell flexed with a sound that made everyone pause. A corner of a sheet that had been tucked tightly the week before gave with a small, metallic groan. Hands moved, Thomas stepping forward first, sleeves rolled, the practiced spine of years behind the movement. He steadied the sheet, eased a strap tighter, and in doing so offered a kind of public endorsement that meant more than any speech could. His voice in that moment lost the caution that had tempered it all along and took on a steadier note. She'll hold, if we keep listening. The storm did what storms do. It tested patience and met it. It did not pry the house open. It did not steal the roof, it battered, it howled, it delivered cold in bulk and with intent. But the house inside stayed livable. People slept in shifts around the stove at first, hands warmed, then replaced by others. Children, whose small bodies demand warmth as a right, were soothed into sleep by the soft, repeated creak of the shell when it took another gust and settled. Neighbors traded stories in the dim light, not to make a narrative for the town, but to keep one another awake and steady. There was gratitude, thin and immediate, as the steam rising from Mrs. Calder's ladle, and there was no fanfare, only the quiet acknowledgment that something had been achieved that could be tested and described. The morning after felt like a modest victory. Snow lay in drifts, carved by the wind, and when people came out with shovels and discouraged faces, the Turners' yard looked intact. There were dents in metal and a place where a corner had been reseeded, but those were small repairs compared to the lives the house had kept from the brittle edge. Mrs. Calder brought bread and said what people say when words fall short. We slept. It was the simplest report of survival. Thomas, who had stood on the porch through much of the night, said little. Privately, he watched the faces of those who had sheltered and felt the slow kindling of a father's pride that neither needed announcing nor apology. The valley's reaction was not uniform. In the days after the storm, some neighbors walked the Turners' fence line with hands in pockets and practical questions on their tongues. They asked about materials and how the vents had behaved. They asked for demonstrations and for the Turners to put their hands on the ribs and feel the give. Others shook their heads and stuck to the old ways, preferring rules that had saved them before. Eli accepted both sorts of responses without surprise. He had never meant to upend an entire valley's approach with one house. He had meant to offer a different way to think about winter, the idea that you could shape where the wind struck and, by doing so, buy a family a few valuable hours of stored heat. A handful of neighbors took his approach as an invitation rather than a manual. Old Mads ordered a smaller, semi-permanent hull over his woodshed. The Calders worked with Thomas to bolt a protective curve over their porch, adapting the ribs to their own roofline and the way their house breathed. There were mistakes. One frame was too tight and caused condensation that stained a wall. Another had a vent placed poorly and made the stove smoke oddly. Each misstep prompted a conversation rather than a scandal. Eli and Thomas helped wherever they were asked, not by handing out instructions, but by showing how they tested a seam and how they responded when something failed. The valley's adaptations remained local and particular. The inverted cabin did not become a one-size answer. It became a method of thinking, observe, trial, adapt. Over the following years, the shell accrued a modest renown. Farmers coming through on business would point to its curve with a small nod. A reporter from the county paper, careful and practical, wrote a respectful piece that spoke of an outer hull and emphasized that the design was context-specific and tested, not gospel. The Turners were careful with such attention. They answered questions with the humility that had shaped the build. This worked here. This is what we learned. They refused quietly to make broad claims. They refused quietly to turn the shell into a product they could sell in town. Eli was not interested in profit. He wanted to preserve the quiet conversation between a house and weather. Eli's life did not become a string of demonstrations. He still fed Hank, still tended the cat, still patched a roof when the seasons demanded it. The shell remained a presence at the edge of his daily life, a curve of metal that caught the light in certain ways and made the yard feel like a protected alcove. He married later than the town gossips expected, to a woman who liked the way he watched storms. They had a child who learned to feel the house's breathing as a lullaby. Over the years, Eli's notebook filled with observations that mixed craft notes and human details. How the shell changed the way neighbors visited, how fewer hands were woken in the night to stoke a fire, how social evening, cards and stew, moved indoors with less worry. Thomas aged into a kind of quiet mentor. He never became a convert of triumph. He remained the man who favored caution and patience, but he learned, in the factual, unflashy way of craftsmen, to value a small experiment that had been pursued carefully. In front of friends he might still call the project stubbornness, but he would say it with a smile that acknowledged the temper of his son's stubbornness, practical, tested, and threaded through with a respect for the old ways. Not every house in the valley took to the idea. Some looked at the inverted cabin and decided their hands were full with other priorities. Some preferred to shore up aging roofs instead. What changed, slowly and importantly, was a posture. People began to think differently about wind and not only about wood. They began to ask whether they could use simple outer measures to make the inner life of a house less frantic. Builders discussed ribs and skins in the depot in the way they used to discuss joints and shingles. The debate remained respectful because the Turners had always asked for conversation rather than submission. As decades advanced, the inverted cabin became a punctuation point in the valley's story. Children who had grown up visiting found themselves telling new neighbors about the time the boy wrapped his house in metal and how the town had sheltered its own that night. The story was told without crowing. It landed as an illustration of careful ingenuity. Eli's name was attached to it in casual speech, but the narrative never leaned on a single hero. It was always a tale of small people doing patient work, a son with curiosity, a father with steadiness, a town that listened when proof was offered. Eli grew older in ways that were readable in quiet things, the deepening of his laugh lines, the steady ache in his hands come March thaw, the way he left the heavier task to younger neighbors but still kept his measuring square in his back pocket. He taught younger men and women what he had learned about watching the wind, about making a seam and checking a vent, about how to be humble in the face of weather. He refused to publish a plan. He insisted instead on apprenticeships. Come help. See how it behaves in your place. The valley's builders learned not to copy, but to adapt. The shell itself endured, scarred and patched, its metal taking on the soft patina of many winters. It was dented from a gust one particularly angry December, and mended by hands that had learned to work slowly. Kids carved their initials in a sheltered wooden post that supported part of the outer hull. The cat that had once slept by the stove was replaced by another cat, and Hank had long since been buried in a shaded corner that smelled of hay. Nature did what nature always does. It wore and renewed. The inverted cabin, as a structure, lived inside that ebb. Years after the storm that had turned curiosity into trust, Eli stood one late afternoon with the sun lowering like an old coin behind the ridge. The shell caught that light and threw it back in a thin, honest glow, neither gaudy nor tame. He felt the slow satisfaction of a life that had been practical and patient. Thomas sat beside him on the porch steps, the two men sharing the quiet of a job done well and a risk taken with due measure. They spoke a little about the years of seam tightening and about small children who had once slept on the floor near the stove. Thomas tapped Eli's shoulder with the tip of a finger, as if approving something that had not needed his blessing but had deserved it. "It changed things," Thomas said simply, the sentence as modest as the men who spoke it. "It did," Eli answered, thinking of smokehouses and ribs and the mule and the measuring square. He did not say the word benchmark. It sat in the mouths of others, not his. Yet he saw it now in how neighbors tightened straps for one another, and how the depot kept a small pile of corrugated sheets for those who asked with care. The inverted cabin had altered a practice without swallowing the valley's traditions. It had, quietly and against the rules many held dear, become an accepted option. When the light died into a cool blue, Eli walked the perimeter and laid a hand on the cool metal. He felt the memory of that first cut and the stitches, the nights of listening, the small ledger of notes he had kept, each one a proof that faith without testing was not his way. He loved that the shell had asked the wind to take its blows so the house inside might breathe easier. He loved more that the town had learned to ask questions before acting and to accept that an answer might be local and not universal. In the end, the story the valley told was a practical one. People spoke of patience and listening. They told of a period when skepticism turned toward curiosity and then affection. They acknowledged the injuries, metal bent, mistakes made, and they spoke of the spirit that corrected those errors: humility, slow work, and shared effort. They did not call it miraculous. They called it useful, measured, and dignified. Built against all the rules, this inverted cabin has become a benchmark in survival, not because it offered a single guarantee, but because it reframed a problem. It taught the valley to think about wind as something to be managed by design and by patience, and it taught a generation that an idea's power lies in careful testing and the willingness to learn from failure. If this quiet story of local ingenuity speaks to you, share it with someone who values patient solutions and community care. It is the sort of thing worth passing on, not as doctrine, but as an invitation to look at problems differently and to build slowly with respect.